All right. Um, so we are here today with John Gladman with City with Dwellings
And Pastor Emily Norris with The Dwelling.
with the Dwelling. They're both here in Winston-Salem, and I thought that they would be great kind of people to talk about education and about religion, which is our current chapter, and just kind of have an informal conversation with you all. You don't necessarily have to look at the camera, but just have an informal conversation with you. I thought we had great conversation before just about education and religion. And so some of the chapter talks about this trend in like some of the influences that religion and education have on people's attitudes and their behaviors. So their attitudes about politics, right? So like this current climate that we're in right now, where people are voting in a certain way, a lot of times we kind of do an analysis of the voting behavior and they're like, oh, more religious people are tend to vote Republican, or more educated people who have a higher level of education tend to vote Democrat, those kinds of things. And so I'm just curious from your perspective, it doesn't necessarily have to be about voting, but just curious from your perspective, like how do you see religion and education playing a role in our kind of dynamics as a society, as American society right now?
So I think there's like a threshold at different points, right? So I think you have folks that are not as educated that do tend to lean more to the very conservative right side. I think you have those middle ground people that are really rooting their faith in logic and scripture. And then I think you have people that go to the very far left that are highly educated and that are very science-based, very fact-based people. But I also think that even within that really far left, there's this subgroup of folks that are not only into science and all of that, but they're into philosophy and they're into the Greek and they're into the really educated piece, the theological pieces of faith, right? And so then there's actually this deeper, profound connection to their faith because they've dug into the theology behind it, right? And it's not just what you're hearing on Sunday mornings. They're taking that education into their own hands theologically too.
Yeah, I actually thought I feel like sometimes, even though we look at those patterns, like the demographic patterns, I do think it's kind of an oversimplification to say, oh, uneducated people are more religious and, et cetera. Especially because, a friend of mine, I had a conversation, we were having a conversation about politics last night, and she was like, well, I think that uneducated people tend to be racist or something like that. And I was like, I don't know if that's like, so I think it's an oversimplification. I think there tends to be more kind of influences, right, in our society that help shape us. And so, it's too simple to say that uneducated people are racist or that uneducated people are religious, when we know that there's kind of other factors that come into play around that.
So this is what I believe. And I work mostly with the indigent population most days. And you can't judge any of them how you see them because you don't know their background. But I think as people, we're all looking for our bunker. We're looking for a place to belong. And sometimes religion holds that placeholder for them, no matter what their economic status is or even their housing status. And an uneducated person, or what would be deemed an uneducated person, or a person of a certain social economic class, wants that place to go. I want to belong to a group of something, right? Of course, I think people attribute the rise of certain extremism, these taking advantage of these kids or these families that are indigent. And you go into foreign countries or wherever it may be, and we feed them, we bring them in, we give them a place to belong, and next thing you know, whatever they're doing. It's kind of the same thing. And what you see, at least what I've seen, in my years of experience, they will find this place to belong. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's hurtful.
Yeah.
But when you add some of that searching for this place to belong with a dual diagnosis of some kind, then you can get bad results. So they may say, well, the church failed me because my life hadn't changed, got me better. And then, and it works the same way with, and I will keep it political, with a political affiliation as well. They feel like there's this thing that has failed them or helped them. And then they become, that dictates the level that they are a follower, that dictates the level that they are a participant in that thing. You know, we have, just to use an example, we have a guy that comes, that we see quite often, that is presents very mentally ill. We give him a Bible twice a week. We give him 2 Bibles a week, and he will read from this Bible aloud. And as you dig, of course, we know we've dug a little deeper into his story, but he has had all these things fail him. Even, you know, he's had a payee that stole his money, all these different things to have failed him. And because, you know, of course, we asked him, you know, where do you go to church? Are you interested in getting a church home? But he doesn't want to do that. That's not where his spirituality is. He wants to get directly from the word. Consequently, we go to register the guy to vote. And he wants to vote, he wants to register with a party that I think is contradictory to what my opinion, I'm sorry. He wants to register in a very right-wing manner. And now this is a guy that sleeps outside and clearly has a mental health issue, who gets a check, has money in the bank, all these different things. And but he believes whatever he's getting from his daily readings and musings, that being in this right wing side or people like him.
Okay.
I think part of that though too is that we as people, we hold on to very specific issues that are important to us, right? And so we find our place within this larger grouping of like-minded people because of that one thing that is our moral thing. So like abortion, right?
Yeah.
Abortion it's not just black and white, right? There's so many layers to that. But people, I think, often will be like, abortion is bad. Why would you want to kill babies? Of course, I'm going to go to this right side place because that's the anti-abortion group.
Right. Yeah.
But I think part of it is that there's a lack of education then about the scale of what that actually looks like. What are late term abortions? What are the terms where that's allowable, and the morality of that too, and right? And
why do people get abortion
and why
in the first
absolutely
place?
and if we had more access to affordable birth control options, we wouldn't even be having this conversation in a lot of instances, right? And so people get so focused on that one thing, but it could be anything, right? That they group themselves where they find similarities on that one topic, and then don't find themselves outside of that political group, because that's where they feel comfortable on that one thing that they're not willing to budge on.
Well, you know, both of your points, I think, are really poignant and really important, because it's about that sense of belonging. And so a lot of time, and we throw this out here all the time, this identity politics, right? Like, oh, they're voting based on identity politics. And usually that's code for racial identity.
Correct.
But there are other identities that also come into play when we're thinking about what groups do we want to belong to. And the irony is that you may choose one political affiliation over another based on one issue. Maybe a lot of people choose it over taxes, right? Or they may choose it over abortion, or what's another issue that they would choose?
Gun rights.
Healthcare.
Governance and healthcare, yeah. And the irony is that you may choose a group affiliation based on an issue, but then all the other kind of political stances
Yeah.
of that group contradict your lived experience.
Absolutely.
But-
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
every social religion
Mhm.
and politics has throughout the years has done a great job causing this division
Mhm.
as well. I'm not a religious scholar, but most of them say you only worship one God,
Yeah.
one me, right? Which makes everything else bad. And I think, in politics and in whatever other social thing you want to say, they want whatever, let's say the Green Party
Mhm.
wants you to be the Green Party because of this one thing only.
Yeah.
And because of the way we do things now in our society, you're boxed in.
Mhm.
And when in reality about religion and politics, it's not about Republican, Democrat, Green Party. It's really about what's best for the people,
Yeah.
what's best for the
Mhm.
society. In the same way with religion, it's not worshiping this one deity, this one entity. It's about improving mankind in some way. But what we've done and what has individuals or individual organizations have seen to work best for them independently is to divide,
Yeah.
dig out all the stuff we want, need, and then leave the ruin to figure out everything else. And I just think that's our society now, which has gotten more is gotten worse in a way that is recognized by some and not recognized by others.
Well, I think we also have to understand. So, like, the founding of this country was never intended to just have two parties,
No.
right?
Right.
And I was listening to a podcast the other day where they were like, how many people knew that there was 5 other people running for president?
Oh yeah, I saw the names pop up and I was like, I don't know
Who?
who that
What?
person is.
And they got votes,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Oh, no.
So,
Great.
there's also this like, what is beneficial, who benefits, right? Who
Yeah.
benefits from us having a 2-party system?
That's right.
And how did that historically come about? And a big part of that is, financial interests, right? It's all these other issues that the parties are holding really almost, in my opinion, would be a distraction from the ultimate goal of making sure that certain parties maintain power, economic power,
That's
right?
right.
And so they maintain economic power by having these topics that the lower income people care about, and lower income meaning like middle class and below,
Right.
care about, to get them to their side. But then that's a distraction from these larger, like, the people who are wealthy on both sides, who benefit from us voting to get them in power so that they can get contracts, they can, that their companies benefit from,
Right.
and that, they can push the financial interests.
Right.
And so that really goes back to a capitalist society, right? Like the politics and all those special interest groups really are more about maintaining wealth.
On both sides.
Yeah, on both sides.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think too, like talking about just the connection of education and faith in that too, is that when you come at scripture from an educated place, I think it's different, right? Because you dig in at different points. And so when you see folks that are on that more liberal side, the distribution of wealth that Jesus calls us to is radical compared to, I would say personally, the right side and how we try to segment it. And so, I don't know, I feel like when that education and faith, when it's mixed together, is incredibly powerful for the people.
Mhm.
And I actually think that that's the life that we're called to as Christians, as people of faith, is to use that power,
Mhm.
right, to speak prophetic truth into places of injustice.
Mhm.
But I think that you only get to that point when there's a certain level of education and it's not just surface level Sunday school Christianity.
Yeah, and a lot of times we, like the
It's disturbing, right?
education.
It's disturbing.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think a lot of times people don't, we're purposefully kept ignorant,
Oh, yes.
right? And so we have the media and other kinds of mechanisms of information that keep people ignorant, so that then their faith becomes a weapon rather than
Right.
a tool.
Right.
And so like, even like, I mean, I think this is a really good story. I saw something earlier today, like, would Jesus go into the temple and grab a Republican or a Democrat button, right? Absolutely not. Jesus would be going into the temple and flipping it and being
Yeah.
like, what the hell are y'all doing?
Yeah.
And like the anger, like just biblically, orgitsu is the word that's used in the Greek, which is a righteous anger, right? Our faith should be calling us to a righteous anger where we are flipping tables, because that's actually the gospel. So we shouldn't just be knocking down the right. We need to be calling the left to account for that as well.
Sure.
And so I think that's the level that we have to start digging into, because it's not, we can't just take what some, modern day prophet stands up and says.
But
Yeah.
Dr. Matthews,
Hi. I'm looking for a place to have a Zoom, but I'll find it.
Okay.
but Dr. Matthews, so in contrast to
Uh-huh.
something you said earlier,
Please start at this door. I gotta start a Zoom at noon, I'm sorry.
okay. So
She needs us to leave.
no.
Oh.
Oh, hold on. I'm sorry.
Hold, please.
So,
Okay, so
But anyway.
I want to change it, just the conversation just a little bit, just to also talk about the role of HBCUs in this conversation. I think a lot of people, like, that conversation has become it's become a conversation this past year. A lot of people are like, wait, what are HBCUs? Like, they didn't even know that they existed, or that they may only know one or two that exist in their local community, like, for example, Winston-Salem State or North Carolina A&T. But there is also kind of a historic underpinning of how HBCUs were established. And I just wanted you to kind of tell a little bit about your story on how you transitioned.
so I graduated from HBCU, Winston-Salem State, go Rams, 1892, all those good things, right? So, but I went to because the way I was socialized, I think growing up, I wasn't, I played a sport. I played soccer, which drew me to have interest in larger non-HBCU schools, right? My dad went to a HBCU. I mean, technically, I'm a legacy of two HBCUs. My dad went to Morehouse, and but I had no interest in going to that HBCU for the simple fact they didn't have the sport that I wanted. And when interest began to come in, I was not drawn to other HBCUs that did have that sport. So
Like Howard University. Thank you very much. Yes, we have soccer.
So on a lurch, I said, well, I'm gonna go to my hometown school to make up some courses and do some other things, and got really drawn into a culture that I'd never experienced before, for lack of better words, and got introduced to other sports. I played football at Winston-Salem State, where I went to Appalachian State to play soccer, and it was a culture shock, right? I go to a school. Now, for me, in my experience, when you go to a university that is, or any school, I think it's the same in high school as well, and I may be wrong nowadays, but and the population is only 5-10% African American. It's almost like everybody knows each other. if not by name, by sight. Over 50% of the guys there are athletes. So if you're an athlete, you definitely know most of them. Large percentage of the females in sororities, you always have this way, and even in passing, I would see people that in Charlotte, just in passing, and it'd be another African American, like, hey, don't you go to Appalachian? And we'd have a conversation and do whatever after that. But so then you come to this place where everybody looks like you, right? And my first few weeks there were different for me. I mean, it's just whatever if anyone has a culture shock experience, I think it's kind of the same thing. You just put a different face on it. I mean, anything from dress, I'm walking around with Salem State with cut off duck heads and a tie-dye shirt and Birkenstocks. And so, I mean, teachers asked me was I on drugs, right? But in Boone, that's how you dress. They didn't, and I'm walking around smiling, waving at people, so happy to see all of this melatonin around me. And
Melanin.
that too. What did I say? Melatonin?
Melatonin gets you to sleep, but melanin.
Well, they had the sleeping pills too, but yeah, all this dark skin around me.
Yeah.
And but I'm expecting everybody. I'm like, hey, and they're looking at me like, what's wrong with this dude?
Yeah.
And I eventually got into the groove and begin to view things almost, you almost view it from a different lens, right? Or I explained it once upon a time as scales being removed from my eyes. I think when you are socialized or grow up a certain way, you can grow up in a bubble.
Yeah.
Right, whatever that bubble is. A lot of times it's economic bubble, and when you are African American and your economic bubble is a bubble that consists of socially a lot of Caucasians or a lot of people that are in the same economic, if they're of your same race, they're the same economic bubble you are, and in my instance, it was athletics. I traveled a lot and I was always around Caucasian people. So it wasn't a thing for me, in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, it was, my sport was not a socially mixed sport. And then you had to afford to be able to play. So it priced out. It's not like you go into African American communities and expect someone to pay $200 a weekend to play soccer. And so the way I was socialized, and then I got into this other whole culture things and began to recognize almost another portion of my existence. Not really by the classwork, but because I was around it now. And that simple exposure, I think, is an eye-opening. And I'm one that never believed that Winston-Salem State, for example, historically has been this independent, started as a teacher's college. Without this entity, African American educators would not been able to go into the schools and into the school systems. Of course, the schools are segregated, so they can only teach at those schools. But it also led to these educators themselves getting higher degrees and educating people that they could get higher degrees too from something that people didn't think that was there. But it took someone that knew the education system to tell you this. And what would our society look like without that? And then without creating that institution for these, back then it was mostly females that went to Slater's Teachers College into the system. And then of course it created a highly accredited and renowned nursing school as well. Where would the diversity come from otherwise? I don't believe it should be whenever HBCU in North Carolina gets into financial peril, the UNC system wants to buy it up, right? Now they want to become the UNC of Winston-Salem. And that has happened at some HBCUs, but it changes the tone and tenor of the whole university. And so that's why I believe they need to be coveted, need to be kept around.
Yeah.
But consequently, in our conversation that we had, and I had with someone else, was, if you're an African American kid with good grades, and you can go attempt to go to certain HBCUs, and their scholarship money is limited. Go to the ACC school. You're going to be one of 10%, and you're going to get a full ride just because of the way you look.
Wow.
And as well on your merit. Don't get me wrong. Your merit will also earn you the scholarship, but that scholarship's not available at an HBCU because there are 20 others trying to get there with your same demographic makeup and probably better grades, but they're interested in going to the HBCU as well. So less people are interested in going to that ACC school with that demographic makeup or with the scores or however they're rating that individual scholarship. But by those opportunities being created at, let's just say, the ACC school, it almost creates a imbalance or inequality, because now you're getting, that sounds bad, all the best talent, even our best talent, simply because you have the economics to do that. And what you leave that university with a different experience, in my opinion only, a different experience that includes limited compassion for your own community or for certain communities.
So you said a lot, and I
have a lot to say. I'm sorry.
I know it's so many layers to that, and I want to try to connect it back to some of the conversations that we've had, the students and I've had. So we actually have quite a few soccer players and athletes in my class, and they talk about like the socialization and how they become a team and like building that rapport with each other. And but I think thinking about it on a higher level, there are some other kind of racial and economic dynamics that come into play that you've talked about. Like, if someone cannot afford, like soccer is actually a poor man's sport, right? Because all you need is a ball. Originally, all you need is a ball. But in the United States, we've made it an elite system, right? So where you have to pay, and you have to be a part of clubs, and you have to go to all tournaments and travel and all those things. And so what is it about the United States in particular that has created this dynamic that it's an elite system, right? And so, and there's like certain white sports versus black sports, right? Basketball actually theoretically should be harder to play because you need a basket, right? And traditionally it was a white sport, but then it transitioned to a black sport, or quote unquote black sport. And so there's those kinds of dynamics, right? Like that you create barriers, economic barriers, to make it racially exclusive. And that comes from this legacy of, is always, you can't separate economics from race in the United States. Really across the world, but especially in the United States, you cannot separate the two. Oftentimes we use economics as a way to create racial segregation, right? And so that's one thing. But then also the purpose of establishing HBCUs and these other Black institutions is because we were excluded from those universities and from those sports, we had to then go create our own. And also understanding that, I was just trying to give them some background on history. HBCUs were established as a part of this reformation of the South after the Civil War. And so they put funding into establishing schools because there was no other mechanism for them to get education and to become professional. The irony is that as the civil reconstruction, not reformation, reconstruction. So then as the Civil War kind of waned off, and there's more and more racism kind of boiling and creating institutions that are separate, they started to take away funding from the HBCUs, right? So North Carolina actually has the highest concentration of HBCUs in the country. But we are the most underfunded, even when they become state funded schools, they have systematically, and even the UNC system president publicly acknowledged on PBS that they systematically underfunded those schools, like took funding away from the HBCUs and put it into UNCs and, you know, those kind of major flagship schools. And so it's like, just want to give that context and that history, you know, to talk about, you know, I think also something else that resonated with me about what you said was like going to predominantly white school. Like I went to predominantly white schools as well growing up. And my parents purposefully put me in those schools because they thought I would get a better education and get more access to resources and opportunity. But in that experience, I also had blatant experiences with racism. I had my life threatened, and you know, I was one of 4 Black girls in my class of 200. And so then I was like, I have to be around people who look like me at least for 4 years, where I don't have to. I want to be a part of the majority. And going to Howard University was my way to do that, right? But then you don't realize that there's other things that you gain from being at an HBCU, which is that you get exposed to the diversity of people, of Black people from around the world, right? You have African, Caribbean, people, other people from the United States who have different experiences, different religions, right? Like there's a Muslim and the Christian and the Jewish, Black Jewish people. Like one of my best friends is a Black Jew. Like who would have thought, you know? So, and then that kind of, and then the exposure that we got in the classrooms, every class, if it was statistics or science or whatever, was tied to the Black experience in some way.
Yes.
You know?
And I, you know, I can echo all those sentiments. I mean, my high school years were much more diverse, and I had an opportunity to go to, I guess, a more predominantly white Catholic school. Where it was, interestingly enough, interestingly enough, probably 90% of the Black males that went to this school played sports. And you know, really the only reason why I didn't go to that school, because they got a really good soccer team. All of my select team, the reason why I was going was for the wrong reasons. And this was a conversation I had with my parents. They told me I was trying to go to this school for the wrong reasons, but I could go if I wanted to. I was in the 10th grade and just getting ready to get my license. So then I was going to have to drive all the way across town to go to this school. And you know how your parents mess with you. You know, I guess my dad just planted that wrong reason seed in my head, right? And I didn't do it. But to the same end, because I lived in that bubble, I was still around these guys. I didn't know anybody from any other schools. Because I didn't hang out, I didn't go anywhere. I was traveling every weekend, and I don't know. And it's the same way now. When you, it's worse now with the way sports is and the way it rules our culture. But another thing that I learned, once again, another lesson from my father, because I got hurt very early in school, and we had the conversation, probably too late in life, of how, because of these physical talents and also because of the color of my skin, I was only a commodity to these people. And when you're at an HBCU, it's almost like you're treated, at least when I was there, I think at schools, depending on the school, the size of the school and all these different things, I think those are an account. But when I was at Winston-Salem State, it was still small enough, I guess, you had even amongst the football team and the coaches, they would ask you like that next level question about your family. We would say, how back then we were still allowed to pray at events and things. And our football coaches would say in our prayer, we would include uh, thankfulness for your community,
Yeah.
thankfulness for your family, and thankfulness for your teammate. Now we get ready to go do something violent, but this was the prayer before the game. And we would go into, as a unit, we would go into the low income communities and walk around and hand out tickets as a group. You're looking at 40, 50 guys walking around Cleveland Avenue homes and Hatfield Garden and passing out football tickets to get people to come to the football games. So we were a community thing. We didn't have money to get our meals were not sponsored like that. We had this group of women that cooked us meals.
Oh, wow.
Home cooked meals.
Yeah.
We'd be on the road, somebody would knock on your door and give you a paper plate with foil over top of it.
Yeah. So
But they knew what like me, they knew what I liked. So, they would, but it was more of a community spirit thing. So then when you graduate, and I think you'll see this across the country, and maybe not in Howard because they're so big and universal, but at some of the smaller HBCUs, you get a kinship to the community. And
I think we still have that at Howard. For sure.
well, heck, ain't nobody afford to live in Washington, D.C. graduate
Not
college.
anymore. But when I
That's
was
what I
at
meant,
school,
yeah.
when I was at school at Howard, that has changed since, like in the last 10 years. Because when I was at Howard, it was all Black neighborhood, right?
Yes.
But then gentrification happened. And so now the entire neighborhood surrounding the university is predominantly white.
My sister lives 2 blocks from Howard right now. So
but the houses used to be these slums, right? Like that the house was worth maybe $60,000 10 years ago. And now it's worth almost like $3 million in 10 years. Yeah.
So Wake Forest has a big brain drain, what they call it, brain drain. Everybody graduates Wake Forest. Once the Salem State graduates all amongst the city that are from Florida, from all these different places, but even still today, because of that sense of community that they got when they were at the school. I guess that's my point. That's what
I was going to say that there's also like a trend of athletes leaving who had committed to ACC or NCAA or whatever. I don't know the terms, but they had committed to predominantly white schools as athletes, and then they changed their mind and went to HBCUs.
That's right. Because I think from the sports perspective, and even from the specialized sciences perspective, once African Americans, especially athletes, can figure out, I can go to this other place and still make it to the NFL, or still go to the NBA, it changes your perspective
and actually get an education.
Right. When you are a top 10 kid coming out of playing basketball, you really could go to any college you want to, and you could go straight to the NBA, but there's a law that's stopping you. And when that first kid did it, that kind of opened the floodgates. And interestingly enough, for me, let's see how it gets stopped. Because for every football player that's in the top 20 or top 300 that goes to an HBCU, that's subtracting wins, which equals dollars from a big school.
Yeah. So
same way in basketball. They're going to stop it. They're going to stop it. Because if I'm a football coach and I'm the highest paid person, like many football coaches are across the country for state schools, they're the highest paid state employee. I'm making $7 million. I got 5 kids leaving to go to this HBCU. You mess with my chick.
Yeah.
And me and my other homeboy that's go all these other state schools or private schools, I get paid to win. We're gonna get together and we're gonna stop these HBCUs from taking our kids. That's just how it's gonna happen.
But it goes back to that economic driver, right? Like even when we try to make things more equitable, if it does not suit the economic bottom line, then those efforts get undermined.
Okay.
Yeah. What were you gonna say? And we
Oh,
can wrap it up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I wonder too if like when the switching to HBCUs, there's a sense of identity piece that
Yeah.
comes with
No
that
doubt.
as well. Whereas these ACC, these Big Ten, I mean, all of those schools, right? Like are recruiting these Black athletes because they're good, one, but also there's that tokenism, right? Like you knew all of the athletes at Boone, right?
Yes.
Right. And so I think that there's more of there's probably an identity piece that comes
Yeah.
that for the long term of like who you are as a person outside of just that 4-year space too.
Exactly.
Yeah, and like once again, it's I recognize different facets of myself when I went to a HBCU.
Mhm.
As long as I was at, it's almost like you leave. I mean, you just recognize different facets of yourself because that's that moment when you can now say to that white person that says, "Oh, well, I don't see color." Now, before I started going to HBCUs, I like, okay, so they're trying to understand race. One semester into an HBCU, if a white person said that to me, I would immediately correct them and say, "Well, you don't see me."
Yeah.
And that was after 2 months. I don't know.
And I
So-
want to clarify that thing for my students because, being at Wake Forest University, they're kind of like, well, I'm learning myself too, and I'm getting, I'm kind of
Right.
being social. And yes, that happens to all college students. But the difference with a school like a HBCU is that when you grow up and you're not used to seeing teachers, professors
Mhm.
who look like you,
That's right.
or seeing, presidents running the university who look like you and who have degrees, who are professional, who are making money, right? And then you having intellectual conversation that is stimulating you in a way that you've never been exposed to in your high school experience, where we were having conversations about social justice, about racial inequality, and like just for example, when I was at my predominantly white high school, I was in a biology class, and they were like, explaining the biological origin of race and saying that white race was the main race and that Negroid and Mongoloid were the sub races. Like, and they taught this as if it was fact. And we all know that is not true, right? But when I go to an HBCU, it's like race is a social construct, and we're using, like there's only phenotypic differences, but we're all a human race. So it's just that nuance difference, right? Or like being required to take courses in Black history and Black politics, right? African history and African politics, taking a hieroglyphs class, like that's the stuff that I got access to at an HBCU that I would never have had access to at a white school. So,
and you get, and I'm saying, I know we're trying to wrap this up.
yeah.
So one of my big intellectual things, I was in an English class and I wrote a paper, and in the paper, I made an identity when I'm explaining I made the identity of his or her Black skin, but the paper also had Caucasian people in it.
Mhm.
And my teacher, I got challenged on why I identified the Black person, why I identified that person as Black, and I didn't identify the other people.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't have gotten that anywhere else.
Yeah.
And yes, I had to. I learned that. I learned that we are socialized in saying that another race is the default race, but I wouldn't have gotten that.
Yeah.
And I've never gotten it in any educational experience. But she challenged me on writing it from the perspective that one race was the default.
Yeah.
And I did, but that was in an English class.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It's something
Well, and that's the power of language too.
Yes.
Right? So, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up because I know we all have things. Thank you, everyone.